is from a eulogy given by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King for Reverend James Reeb, Brown Chapel in Selma, Alabama, March 15, 1965. Reeb was a Unitarian Universalist minister who had answered King's call to come to Selma and had been murdered there. One day, the history of this great period of social change will be written in all its completeness. On that bright day, our nation will recognize its real heroes. There will be thousands of dedicated men and women with a noble sense of purpose that enables them to face fury and hostile mobs with the agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of the pioneers. There will be faceless, anonymous, relentless young people, black and white, who have temporarily left behind the towers of learning to storm the barricades of violence. There will be old, oppressed, battered Negro women, symbolized in a 72-year-old Negro woman in Montgomery, Alabama, who rose up with a sense of dignity and with the people decided not to ride the segregated buses, who responded with ungrammatical profundity to one who inquired about her weariness, "My feet is tired, but my soul is rested." They will be ministers of the gospel, priests, rabbis, and nuns who are willing to march for freedom, to go to jail for conscience's sake. One day the South shall know from these dedicated children of God, courageously protesting segregation, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream, standing up with the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby carrying our whole nation back to those great wells of democracy that were dug deep by the Founding Fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So I can say to you this afternoon, my friends, that in spite of the tensions and uncertainties of this period, something profoundly meaningful is taking place. Old systems of exploitation and oppression are passing away. Out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equity are being born. Doors of opportunity are gradually being opened. Those at the bottom of society, shirtless and barefoot people of the land, are developing a new sense of somebody-ness, carving a tunnel of hope through the dark mountain of despair. People who stand in darkness have seen a great light. Here and there, an individual or group dares to love and to rise to the majestic heights of moral maturity. The words of Dr. Martin Luther King. Thank you, Jack. I am a racist. The lead story in this morning's Cape Cod Times carries the welcome news that Elenita Muniz's job is safe, at least for the next few months. Some of you may recognize the title of this sermon as the words which got Elenita in hot water. Elenita is a strong human rights advocate and has served for the past several years as the coordinator of the Barnstable County Human Rights Commission. I have the honor to serve as Chatham's town representative to that body and have had occasion to work closely with Elenita. Not incidentally, Elenita is also an active member of our mother church, First Parish Brewster. Elenita's quotation came about because she was invited, along with Human Rights Commission Chairman John Reed, to be on a panel at the community college on the aftermath of the police shootings in Ferguson, Missouri, and Staten Island, New York. Cases in which the failure of grand juries to indict white police officers who killed unarmed black citizens had spawned demonstrations across the country. Starting in early December and continuing through this week, people, young and old, black and white, marched in the streets to insist that Black lives matter. This past weekend, they even blocked I-93 in Boston. The panel discussion at Four Seas December 9th was concerned with race, policing, and what we could do about it. John Reed and another member of the panel are African American men. The panel was held in conjunction with the International Human Rights Day, December 10th. In fact, Elenita was just concluding her work organizing for the Human Rights Day breakfast the next day. Elenita, if you haven't met her, is of Puerto Rican descent, but her skin is white, her eyes are blue. She was the last to speak. I shouldn't say white. That skin is sort of pink, you know. The story on this event, which ran in the following day's Cape Cod Times, started this way. Quote, "I'm racist," Elenita Muniz told a crowd gathered at Cape Cod Community College on Tuesday. Muniz, coordinator of the Barnstable County Human Rights Commission, said she took an online quiz showing that even she, a blue-eyed Puerto Rican and human rights advocate, harbors racist views, unquote. That was the lead of the article. But what probably had more impact was this quote further down. Quote, "Racism is alive and well in this country, and everyone who is white-skinned is racist," Muniz said. "The bottom line is, just as men are responsible for ending sexism, only white people can end racism, and so we need to work on that. It is very hard to acknowledge our privilege," unquote. Well, these quotes created a firestorm in the letters to the editor column of the Cape Cod Times and on talk radio, and there was a demand for Elenita's resignation. I have been involved in defending her and defending the Human Rights Commission, for I think she basically spoke the truth. Now, a big problem in discussing this publicly is that there are so many definitions of racism. If we think about the civil rights movement of the 1960s, we see a kind of overt racial hatred allied with societal power. If you haven't seen the movie Selma, let me urge you to go see it. You could not do anything more appropriate to honoring Dr. King this weekend. It's playing right here at the Orpheum at 2:30 this afternoon. Thank you, Naomi. As the movie vividly depicts, there really was a vicious white power structure in the South in the 1960s, which was determined to maintain segregation and to keep blacks from power. And the strategy in Dr. King's challenge to that power structure was to provoke it into violence without engaging in violence themselves. The movie makes clear that he understood that the marchers would have to face and suffer violence in order to move the American people to make structural changes in voting rights. He is morally torn as he recognizes that he is leading some of his lambs to the slaughter. I stand with Elenita and say I am a racist, but that does not mean I have an ounce of sympathy with the bad guys in the movie. To the contrary, I was so moved by this film, I was shivering throughout it, and my admiration for Dr. King was unbounded. He had a great gift for articulating the moral imperative of universal love. And I have to say there's a little professional envy in that, as I view him. As Ann Deers put it in the anthem the choir sang, he was a man of peace who saw what needed to be done to make the world more just and fair. Dr. King attacked a racist social structure which had kept African Americans from political and economic power in the South since the end of Reconstruction, and before that had held most of them in slavery. Dr. King's hope was that if he could get this overt racism displayed in all its violence and ugliness for the country to see, it would be possible politically to move forward on voting rights. The movie depicts Lyndon Johnson as being opposed to introducing voting rights legislation, but Bill Moyers, who was an assistant to Johnson at the time, says that Johnson was simply waiting for King's actions to generate for him the political support he would need to actually win the fight. Well, it would be nice to report that overt racism that the nation faced in 1965 has been overcome. but in fact it has not. Disenfranchisement of black voters in the South and elsewhere has been aggressively pursued by Republican-led legislatures across the country, and the courts are of no help. We have a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who made his name as a young lawyer in the Justice Department in the Reagan administration, trying to find ways to weaken the Voting Rights Act. He finally accomplished this last year with the decision Shelby County versus Holder, a 5-4 decision gutting the key pre-clearance provision of the act on the basis that it was, quote, based on 40-year-old facts having no logical relationship to the present day, unquote. In other words, racial disenfranchisement was a thing of the past. The dissenting liberal justices had to acknowledge that discrimination in voting had diminished since 1965 in the states and jurisdictions covered by the act. But that was because of the act. And that, quote, throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. Now, when Dr. King led his marches on that historic march from Selma to Montgomery 50 years ago this spring, I was not among them. One person in this room was Gene Pickett, who then served our congregation in Atlanta, joined the marches for the last day. He heard Dr. King's address from the front steps of the Alabama Capitol, and he knew James Reed. One of the most thrilling things about the movie Selma was it gave supporting roles to and named the 2 UUs who were murdered in the course of the Selma campaign. If you go to see the movie, Reed as the minister appears first in a clerical collar, but then in his signature bow tie. Maybe this is a little tribalism on my part. The first person killed, Jimmy Lee Jackson, was not a UU and was a young African American, where Reverend Reed and Viola Liuzzo were white. I don't want to elevate UU martyrs or white martyrs above black martyrs or those from any other faith. The effort was a joint, interfaith, interracial work under the direction of Dr. King. But UUs were and are a tiny minority of the American religious landscape. And I am proud that Reed's death, coming in the week after Bloody Sunday, the face-off at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, no relation, appears to have had a significant influence in turning the tide politically in favor of voting rights. Here is the story from Reed's entry in the Dictionary of Unitarian and Universalist Biography. That's a great resource, by the way, D-U-U-B. Just Google that. It'll take you right there, give you all kinds of information about Unitarians and Universalists who have gone on before. So this is a direct quote. On Sunday, March 7th, 1965, 500 civil rights marchers in Alabama attempted to walk from Selma to Montgomery and were brutally beaten and gassed by state troopers and local police. On Monday, the Unitarian Universalist Association in Boston received a telegram from Martin Luther King Jr. calling for ministers and people of all faiths to come to Selma to support the marches. By the next day, 45 Unitarian Universalist ministers and 15 laypersons had answered King's call and journeyed to Selma. Jim Reed answered the call, even though his wife did not wish him to go. On Tuesday afternoon, he joined 2,500 marchers for the second march from Selma to Montgomery. Once again, the police stopped them, and once again, the marchers returned to Brown's Chapel AME Church for an evening of speeches, singing, and prayers. That evening, Reed had supper with 2 Unitarian Universalist colleagues, Orloff Miller and Clark Olson, at Walker's Cafe, a local black restaurant. He had planned to return to Boston that night, but changed his mind. He called his wife to say he was staying one more day. Leaving the cafe to return to Brown's Chapel, the trio took a wrong turn and strayed from a black neighborhood into a white neighborhood. Outside of the Silver Moon Cafe, 4 men yelling, "Hey niggers, hey you niggers," viciously attacked and beat them. The result left Miller and Olson wounded, while Reed was severely injured by a blow to his skull from a club. Reverend James Reed died 2 days later of these wounds and had a memorial service in Brown's Chapel in Selma on Monday, March 15th, attended by UUA President Dana McLean Greeley and over 100 ministers, at which Dr. King delivered the eulogy, an excerpt of which I read earlier. The murder of Reeb helped sway public and congressional opinion. The night of his funeral, President Johnson made an address to a specially convened session of both houses of Congress, proposing the Voting Rights Act and ending with the statement, "We shall overcome." The murder of Reeb also deeply affected UUs nationwide, and there were memorial services in several churches, including one in Detroit. A UU laywoman named Viola Liuzzo attended that service and departed for Selma the next day to aid in the struggle. She assisted in logistics for the third march, and after it concluded, she drove 5 marches back to Selma and then was returning to Montgomery when she was murdered on the highway. Now you may be thinking by this time that these events of 50 years ago are wonderful, heroic, inspiring, but what have they to do with why Elenita Muniz would declare herself a racist and the reason why I would join her in that? Let me answer that with a perspective on how I came to go into ministry from being a lawyer in Charleston, South Carolina. In the early 1990s, I was sitting in the choir loft of the Unitarian Church in Charleston, one of the most beautiful UU churches in the country, and the oldest in the South, pondering its soaring perpendicular Gothic arches and listening to a sermon by Floy Work, one of our lay members. Floy had established the first homeless shelter in Charleston. Her sermon was entitled, "Changing the World," and she started it off by saying, "I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes about what I've been doing, because then the rest of you are going to tell us what you've been doing to change the world." I got up when my time came and described my work with the ACLU, but the whole thing started me thinking, oh yeah, change the world. That was what I was supposed to be doing with my life. I was a high school junior when the events of Selma happened 50 years ago and 3 states away. I did not go there, I did not march, but I did participate in an interracial discussion group among high school students from the city's schools, which were still completely segregated at that time. In general, I came of age when the Civil Rights Movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement and the women's movement had morphed into something just called the movement. The movement was a general push for liberation from structures of oppression wherever they were found. And I would say that my life has been a series of forays into various battlefields of this struggle and various retreats for R&R. After hearing that sermon, I came to a realization that race was still an issue in society, and for me personally. And it presented many aspects, legal, economic, moral, but the one important aspect of racism was spiritual. And one way to deal with it was through religion, and maybe that was the path for me to go. That insight still holds for me, having taken that path 20 years later. Racism, if you break it down, is a spiritual illness. It is the illusion of separation, the illusion that there are lines to be drawn between people so that you can put them in pigeonholes. And these lines have to do not only with what a person's skin color, eye color, and hair texture are, but the traits of that person's biological forebears, their ancestry. Now, there are many forms of racism. Individual color prejudice, refusal to sit next to a person of color on the airline, is probably on the wane. But the statistics of everything from police shootings to economic success to education indicate that institutional racism is still quite a factor in American life. Dr. King articulated a dream in 1963. One of us was there that day. That someday there would come a time when his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The victories won in the 1960s did not bring about that day. Racism did not disappear. It did not disappear with the election of a president descended from Africans. It did not disappear from our culture, our history, or our hearts. The great race theorist Cornel West taught at Harvard for a while. and once spoke to our theology class in the divinity school when I was a student there. At the question and answer session afterwards, I asked him whether if he and I should meet someday in heaven, I would see a black man or a raceless man. His reply was, you should see a black man, because a black man is what I am. My blackness is an essential part of me. West's fine book of the 90s is titled Race Matters. And I guess his answer to me is that even in the most perfect existence we can imagine, our races will still matter. But I have to say this perplexes me. It seems to me that I've been working my whole life to dismantle racism in my culture, my community, my own heart, and I have looked forward to a time when race will not matter. Earlier we read the beautiful Litany of Restoration in our hymnal by one of our African-American UU ministers, the late Marjorie Bowen Sweetly, which said, if you are black and I'm white, it will not matter. But West's answer to me makes me question whether this wish for it not to matter is itself racist. Because, of course, part of the problem with racism from a white perspective is you don't see it every day. If you are that's the essence of what they call white privilege. You don't have to worry about race every day when you wake up in the morning because you're the dominant side of the racial paradigm. Racism as a spiritual illness is a little like alcoholism. It works by denial. It tries to convince you it isn't there. Many whites in this country and in this community buy that racism is a problem of the past. But then events always show that this is wistful thinking, that the experience of people of color in this country is significantly different from that of whites in employment, in police encounters, in mortality, and in incarceration rates, and that we are still a far cry from Dr. King's dream. The public statement, I am a racist, says that the responsibility for dismantling racism in all its forms, individual and institutional, overt and covert, conscious and unconscious, is a burden we all share. Black and white and yellow and brown, gay and straight, male and female, and all genders in between. Yes, I've dedicated my life to the eradication of racism, as well as all other oppressions, but the statement, I am a racist, is a recognition that I haven't succeeded even in my own soul, that I have work to do. The first step in solving this problem is the recognition that we have a problem, and the denial that we have a problem is a large part of what keeps us from reaching Dr. King's dream. You can take the implicit association test, IAT, just Google IAT online, as I did, and as Elenita did. It's for free. It's about 10 minutes, and it's a psychological test that has a very clever design. It flashes pictures of faces. First it flashes a picture of a face for long enough for you to really recognize it. Then immediately it'll flash a picture of a face too short for you to even see it, or consciously see it. That's the key face, and that face will either be black or white. Then we'll have a picture of some symbol or a word, which may have good associations or bad associations. And you are to report on how warmly you feel about that word. But that will be affected by what you've seen subliminally just before it. It's so clever that you can't fake it. You can't say, this is what I ought to be feeling. You've got to do it by what you actually are feeling. It can psych out that. And when it comes out to, all of us are going to come out with a certain amount of racial animosity. It's actually an indication of our progress that the word racist has a strongly negative cast in almost all quarters of society. No one cops to being a racist, except for a few of us crazy liberals. And I get it, that it is highly offensive to some people, for liberals like myself and Elenita to say that all white people are racist. Well, this is saying you are a racist too. And that's quite a different statement from saying I am a racist. A new friend of mine who studied communication professionally explained it this way. It's like you came into the room and said, I don't know you, but I know you're a jerk, and you don't realize what a jerk you are, and I'm not going to tell you how I know or what you can do about it. Yes, I see that that's highly offensive. But I also see that we get nowhere against racism as long as whites are not accepting their responsibility for maintaining it. It's not just a problem of color. It's a problem as society. It's not just a problem for people of color. It's a problem for all of us. And the solution begins with us. Amen.